you. It's lovely to see at least virtual names of many people that I haven't seen since I left DC. So it's good to touch base with all of you virtually. Okay, so let me go ahead and share some slides. And then I should kind of caveat this to say that I've put together probably about 40 minutes worth of slides, but I would love to kind of take questions and have more of a discussion. So please don't hesitate to type something in the chat window or interrupt me if you have questions at any point. So no need to sit in complete silence. Okay, so this talk that I put together is pretty targeted because when they reached out to me and asked me to come and give this talk, it was right after we published this new paper on a flare that we detected from Proxima Centauri. And so I've kind of ignored a lot of other research that my group has been doing and focused the talk, entirely on that paper and kind of the motivation for it and where we're sort of going in that work now. So that's a brief overview. Before I dive too far into things, I want to acknowledge kind of everybody else that's not me, that's not giving this talk, who's been involved with this particular project and is working in my research group. So this is the complete list of co-authors on the paper that we published earlier this spring. Tom is on the call, or at least connecting to audio, and he's one of the co-authors, so you can ask your own resident Goddard expert exactly what we've been up to. And I'll also mention and highlight that everybody's name who's in blue is either a student or a postdoc. So there's quite a few early career people who've been involved in this, so keep an eye out for their names in the future. And I'll give a brief introduction to my group specifically here at CU Boulder. We as a research group, which Joe kind of already introduced, are very interested in using observational work to try and understand stars, disks, and planets. And I'm really interested in kind of the interplay between those and what those can tell us about astrobiology. So right now we have people working in the group on kind of these big three questions. We think about disks around stars and how structure of disks can relate to planets, how the composition of exoplanets is inherited from that disk material. And then, what's most prevalent today in my talk is talking about how stellar activity can play a role in this whole process. And all of the photos at the bottom here are my students and postdocs. Anna Estes is an undergrad who's been working for me for the last 2 years. She's now graduated and heading out to grad school. Spencer Hurt is another undergrad working in my group. Kiana is a brand new grad student starting this fall. Jay is a grad student who's going to be in his second year, and Ward Howard is joining us as a postdoc in September. So you'll see their names on various slides as they've kind of contributed to work, and I try and call out what they've been doing. Okay, so I know that many people on this call are very familiar with stellar activity, but I wanted to start with kind of a motivation for planetary habitability, stellar flares, and why we would care at all. So what we often see as astrophysicists is when we talk about exoplanets, we define a very simple criteria for whether a planet may or may not be habitable. And often that is by defining what we call the habitable zone, right? Which is done in this nice little cartoon here, and saying that the habitable zone, at a given time in a planet's history, the habitable zone is the range of distances, right, at which you could move a planet and potentially have surface temperatures that allow for abundant liquid water on the surface of the planet. And that makes a lot of assumptions, right? We're assuming this is an Earth-like world, that it has an Earth-like composition, an Earth-like atmosphere, and then we're simply asking, where can we take this Earth and move it away from this star and have it be at just this right temperature where we could have liquid water, right? We move too close, all that water evaporates. We move too far away, all that water freezes out. And so this is kind of a pretty simplistic view of what planetary habitability means. And I always like to show this just to say that there's a lot of other factors that we might care about when we talk about planetary habitability, which are not encompassed in this sort of simple definition of a habitable zone. So this is, some assortment of other ones that I've thrown on this slide, right? We might care about the size of the planet. We could care whether it has plate tectonics that allow for this, global CO2 cycle that we have on Earth. We could care whether that planet has a magnetic field, which is tied to whether the planet has a molten core. We care about the atmosphere, how quickly the planet is rotating, because that connects to the magnetic field. We could care about its volatile composition. Does it have volatiles incorporated in it that allow it to have an atmosphere? From a more disk planetary evolution perspective, our outer giant planets seem to play a potentially important role in blocking impacts. Maybe that's something we care about. And of course, stellar activity, which is where I'm going to kind of focus today. Okay, so putting that in a broader habitability context, let's zoom in on stellar activity and flares. So the kind of main story here, right, is that when a star is active, like our sun is active, it produces what we call flares, which are outbursts of radiation, this high energy X-ray, UV radiation. Large flares on the sun are often associated with CMEs, or coronal mass ejections, which are actual energetic particles getting thrown out. Those high energy radiation and particles stream out into space, and they can impact a planet here. And essentially they can, ionize or even erode a planetary atmosphere over time. And one of the main processes by which that happens is by having this kind of charged particles or high energy radiation come into the atmosphere and start splitting apart molecules, things like ozone and water. You split them up into hydrogen and oxygen. Those are much lighter atoms, not molecules anymore, and then they can be stripped away from the atmosphere. And so you can, if you have enough flares happening frequently enough, you can essentially start to split apart your atmosphere and then lose that atmosphere to space faster than you can regenerate it from the planet. So this doesn't seem so great for any potentially habitable life on, say, this planet if the star is particularly active. Now, in our own solar system, this is happening, but clearly we're here, so it's not horrible. We can see evidence for the activity of our sun in lots of different places. The most beautiful example is the Aurora that we see on Earth, which are particles making it way into our atmosphere at the poles, right? The poles of our magnetic field. They ionize the gases in the atmosphere, and they create these beautiful green and red glows. When particularly active periods happen, sometimes you can see those aurora extend further down to lower latitudes. But that is a beautiful example of this kind of same process that we're talking about. Most famous when we talk about the sun's activity is the Carrington Event, which happened back in 1859. So there's not amazing data to compare with, right? Because we were still at the time in astrophysics where we're drawing pictures of sunspots by hand. But essentially the Carrington Event is a CME that hit the magnetosphere and is thought to have induced the largest geomagnetic storm on recorded record for Earth. The general predictions are that if that happened today, it would cause widespread, electrical disruptions, blackouts, deep GPS interruptions, and be, quite catastrophic for, say, our electrical grid and our communications. Okay. The most obvious example of, stripping from the sun is actually Mars. And I show this a lot. I teach an astrobiology class here, and Mars is a really nice example to sort of compare to the sun, to the Earth. And, essentially Mars is a smaller planet, right? So it has cooled much faster than the Earth has, which led it to lose its magnetic field. So Mars no longer has a magnetic field deflecting this energy and particles and protecting it. Instead, the full brunt of everything from the sun hits Mars. And so these are images from the MAVEN mission, which was led from LASP and CU here, showing atomic carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. And you can see, the left side of these images is towards the sun, the right side is away from the sun. And so this glow is actually, carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen getting stripped just from the solar wind. So the solar wind is, hitting, as in this schematic here, Mars, and it's peeling all of this atmospheric gas away. Okay. But the real story, which I liked in this article that was published in the New York Times, kind of following our press release for our paper, is that the sun is really kind of a boring star. Like, I can show you examples of beautiful Aurora and Mars getting stripped, but none of these are particularly extreme events. And overall, our sun seems to be a pretty friendly star to live around. It doesn't have a huge amount of flares. They're not enormous compared to other stars. It's kind of a nice one. And that is really an important contrast, right, when we start to think about exoplanets around other types of stars. So, to motivate that, right, I show this in my astrobiology class as well, which is just a chart from a textbook that says the types of stars, right, which we're all familiar with as astronomers, and then what fraction of the stars in our galaxy they are, right? And M dwarfs make up 70% of the stars in our galaxy. So when we talk about other planets around other stars in our galaxy, more often than not, we're talking about M dwarfs. And M dwarfs are a completely different beast, whereas our sun is nice and quiet and chill. M dwarfs are much more active with much higher energy events. Okay, so that's kind of the motivation for where I'm coming from with this. And then, to narrow it down on one question, I think the question really is like, what do we mean by habitability when we're talking about an M dwarf planet? And part of that is considering the stellar radiation environment that that planet is existing in. So I want to give a brief couple of slide intro to ALMA, which is a telescope that a lot of this data comes from, and is very frequently used in planet formation studies because ALMA has pretty much revolutionized our understanding of planet formation. There's a beautiful image out today in a press release that actually is like imaging a moon forming disk around a newly formed planet in a newly formed solar system. So go look up the new image from ALMA of PDS 70 if you haven't seen it already. ALMA's been amazing, and we've been using it a lot also to look at stellar activity. But I realize it's not the most common telescope for exoplanet scientists to use. So this is my kind of brief intro to ALMA. So ALMA consists of these 66 radio antennas that are built in the Atacama Desert in Chile. So you can see ALMA here in a pretty compact configuration. It's out in this high, very arid plain. These are kind of the stats of ALMA. So the elevation of the site is about 5,000 meters. That's roughly 17,000 feet. These antennas can actually be reconfigured, and they can be spread to be either as close as 150 meters to greater than 16 kilometers apart. And ALMA is a millimeter telescope. So the shortest kind of band that we're working in is, say, 0.3 millimeters out to, 8 millimeters. And the resolution that we can get with ALMA when you spread things out by 16 kilometers is, down to maybe 1,000th of an arc second. And this is the kind of red box that's highlighting the site here. So this is, the Atacama Desert up here, and ALMA sitting right up here on the border with Bolivia and Paraguay. So this is to kind of break down how this array is split up. There are 50 antennas that are about 12 meters in diameter, and this is what's called the main array of ALMA. And then there is a smaller subarray that's called the Atacama Compact Array, which is only 12 smaller 7-meter antennas. And so most of the work I've been doing in stellar flares is using this sort of compact subarray of ALMA. This is really the array that you get most of your resolution and beautiful images from. And because there's not long baselines in this compact array, it's much better if you're looking at an unresolved point source like a star. And all of these can be picked up and moved to these different pads. And this I just think is really cool because there's a giant caterpillar that comes along and it scoops up an ALMA antenna and it drives it across the desert for a day, 16 kilometers, and then it plops it down another pad. And so this is just a picture of how they actually move these antennas around. And for the sort of DC-centric view, to give you a sense of scale for ALMA, if you were to take all the antennas and move them as close as possible, you could fit them all on the ellipse of the White House, shown here, right? And if you were to take them and move them as far apart as possible, you would basically span the entire beltway. So that's a huge, maneuverability of the array. Okay, so let's move on to actually talking about Proxima Centauri. Many of you are probably very familiar with it, but Proxima Centauri is an M5.5 star. It's our closest neighbor at 1.3 parsecs. We have known for a while that it has at least one planet, right, from 2016. This planet, Proxima Centauri B, is a little bit bigger than an Earth mass, so it's about 1.3 Earth masses, and it's orbiting in the habitable zone of the star at 0.05 AU. There was a paper that came out just last year by Damaso et al. Indicating another planet in the system. That one's a bit bigger, closer to 6 Earth masses, and it's sitting quite a bit further out at 1.5 AU. And I got interested in the system because there was a paper published in 2017 claiming the system of debris disks surrounding the star. And so they proposed a system of 3 rings, a really close inner warm belt, a slightly colder belt at 1 to 4 AU, and then a really cold outer Kuiper belt analog. And these were claimed from ALMA observations. And so, this got a lot of attention because it would be very exciting for a number of reasons, right? For one, now Proxima starts to look like a small mini solar system because it's got a star and a couple planets and a system of debris rings, just like we have an asteroid and a Kuiper belt. And, if you know that there's rings, you can get an inclination from resolved rings. You can sort of break the sign I degeneracy on the planet mass. So lots of reasons why we want these rings to be real. So let's start by looking at those ALMA observations. I was very interested in this result, and I downloaded these archival observations to take another look at them. And it was very interesting. The left panel here is showing all of that ALMA data that was used in that original paper imaged together. The catch is that actually they had observed for something like 13 hours. And so this image shows 13 hours of ALMA observations, averaged together, imaged just as one observation. There's a point source in the center. It's about 340 microjanskis. That's brighter than the star should be. We'd expect the star to be, 70 microjanskis or so. And so it was this excess flux that was attributed to a dust ring, because it's pretty common to say, okay, I detect this point source. I know what the stellar flux should be. Seems a little bit brighter at millimeter wavelengths. We can attribute that to dust because basically, the star heats up the dust glows brightly in the infrared, it gets heated, and then we see this excess at infrared, millimeter, and radio wavelengths. Things got interesting when you start splitting this data up. So the middle panel is actually the first 12 hours of observations. It's just excluding that 13th hour. This looks different. There is nothing detected in this image above a 3 sigma. These are 2 sigma contours. If you place an upper limit on that, the flux is something less than 200 microjanskis, but there's really no indication of anything in this middle image at all. And if you image only the last hour, that 13th hour of observations, you get the right panel, where now there's an even brighter point source with a flux of a little over a millijansky. So something seems to be off, right? There's something time variable in this data. We can actually look with finer time resolution than that. ALMA has a 1 second integration time. And so we can actually, not even just look at the entire hour of data, but look at every single, 1 second integration through that entire hour. And if you do that, what you get is this plot on the right. Essentially, we see no signal from the star at all. It's undetected, except for about 2 minutes, during which the star goes through this series of small pre-flares, these kind of small oscillations, and then has a very large flare up to almost 100 millijanskis in flux, and then it fades back away. So this is time relative to the peak of this flare. Outside of the flare, we actually don't detect the star at all. It looks exactly like this sort of middle panel. Okay, so this was new and surprising, and it kind of means, 2 things here that are important. One, there's no evidence of any excess that's constant. So there's no reason to think that there's any disks in the system at all. All of that excess flux that was attributed to this system of debris rings disappears because, when we image it, when it's not flaring, the star is not unexpectedly bright. But it was the first time that we'd ever actually detected flaring emission from an M dwarf at millimeter wavelengths. We had kind of largely ignored the millimeter as a potential wavelength to study stellar activity. We just never actually detected anything. And so this was kind of a new window on stellar activity. And we can do quite a bit more with ALMA observations that start to get really interesting. ALMA doesn't actually just observe at one wavelength or one frequency, it observes in a bandwidth, which is about 8 gigahertz. So there's what we call a lower sideband that's about 4 gigahertz in width, and an upper sideband that's 4 gigahertz in width. And so those frequencies are, the lower one is 225 to 227 gigahertz, and the upper one is 239 and 241. So we can actually, all of this is observed simultaneously, so we can split, the upper and the lower sidebands from each other and look at the flux in those two things. And then we can use that to determine a spectral index, basically how the flux varies as a function of frequency. And so what this plot is showing here is the top is just our light curve, it's flux density, now binned into 5-second intervals. These individual sidebands are the green and the purple lines, and then the calculated spectral index is this middle panel. And you can actually see that as the flare happens, the spectral index changes dramatically. So it goes from being sort of a Rayleigh Jeans, which is what we'd expect, if it's just the photosphere, it should have a spectral index of 2, to having this steeply negative spectral index during the flare peak and then returning back to a Rayleigh Jeans tail as it comes out of the flare. ALMA actually also observes in 2 linear polarizations. So it observes in both the XX and YY polarization. It can observe in the cross products, the XYYX, but that's a separate calibration scheme, and so we didn't have that data for this. But you can use the XX and YY to actually recreate a lower limit on the Stokes Q, the fraction of linear polarization. And so this is showing that lower limit on the fraction of linear polarization Q over I. And as you go into the flare, there's evidence that it becomes partially polarized. It actually flips sign here, and then it returns not having any polarization as it comes out of the flare. So we can start to learn a lot of interesting things about the flare physics, because now we're seeing that there's a change in the spectral index, and there's also a change in the polarization fraction as this flare happens at millimeter wavelengths. Okay, so that was exciting, right? We found the first millimeter flare, and then there were a lot of questions, right? Because we found one flare, and I can't draw a whole lot of conclusions about the population of M dwarf millimeter flares by only detecting one event, and also it's only in the millimeter, so I can't tell you whether it correlates with flaring at other wavelengths. And the key really is that stars, when they flare across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. And if we want to get a complete picture, a physical picture of these flares, we need to use multi-wavelength observations. And so this is a schematic from a paper by Klein and Dalla in 2017 that shows kind of this simple loop structure of flares, right? Where you have magnetic loops that get twisted, they snap and break and reconnect, and then tries to highlight where different wavelengths of light are coming from in this sort of loop structure, right? Where the radio waves are coming kind of higher up in the loop, and visible light, hard X-rays are coming down at these foot points where the loops connect with the stellar photosphere. And this is obviously over a much narrower range of wavelength, but I really like this schematic from the sun that shows from 131 to 1600 angstroms, just a solar eruption happening, and depending upon the wavelength you look at, you either see this nice loop structure, you see something more extended. So clearly things are varying even across a short wavelength range. This collaboration, we set out to try and put this millimeter flaring emission into a context, and then actually understand how it relates across the electromagnetic spectrum, and really do a definitive study of multi-wavelength flares from Proxima Centauri. And so we constructed this campaign. We observed for roughly 40 hours on source between April and July of 2019. And this is the whole suite of telescopes that was used for those observations. So all these facilities were coordinated to observe simultaneously. So not just each of them observing for 40 hours, but each of them observing for the exact same 40 hours. So we have ALMA sampling down in the millimeter. We have several ground-based telescopes, the DuPont telescope at Las Campanas, which is we used for spectroscopy, every scope for photometry, LCOGT, again, optical photometry. TESS was observing at the same time, So we get space photometry, and then we used STIS on Hubble for UV spectroscopy, SWIFT in the UV and X-rays, and then Chandra in the X-rays as well. And so there's also a coordinating campaign that involves some Australian telescopes, which Andrew Zick, who's a grad student in Australia, used. There is some overlap with that in that, obviously the time in Chile doesn't overlap with the time in Australia so much, but we were able to get some overlapping data there as well. Okay, so I will initially caveat this by saying that doing a campaign like this is challenging, and I'd like to show this giant spreadsheet that I created while I was trying to conduct these observations. This is showing each of those telescopes, right, as an individual column. Everything in green are observations that went off with no hitches. Things in yellow are kind of worked. Things in red, either we couldn't schedule things to overlap or something went bizarre. As it turns out, when you try and get 8 telescopes to stare at the same thing at the same time, lots of things start happening to telescopes. So there's some data here we lost from HST because HST was having a gyro issue at the time. Some interesting things happened with ALMA. There was a power outage one night it snowed. So I show this just to kind of make the point that it's hard to do these multi-wavelength campaigns and to kind of open a discussion, because clearly this has valuable science that can come out of it, and interested in trying to think about how we can better enable people to do this kind of multi-wavelength work, and also to show you that there's a lot of nights where there's a lot of green, right, where we were actually successful in getting many of these telescopes to observe at the same time, and we have some really interesting multi-wavelength data as a result. Okay, so let's just dive into the results from this paper. So this is kind of the meat of the paper, this plot that shows sort of the definitive light curve of what we detected. And so I'll step you through this. This upper left panel is kind of the cumulative multi-wavelength light curve. So all of the y-axes are in a flux that's been normalized to sort of the quiescent median value. So you can look at this as a brightening factor during the flare. And then on the bottom x-axis is just the true time in barycentric modified Julian date. And the top y-axis is now showing you time relative to the flare peak as we observe it with ALMA. And this is stepping through in wavelength from longest with ALMA at the top through TESS, DuPont, and then Hubble at the bottom. So we caught this flare with 4 different facilities. For DuPont, I'm showing the H-alpha and helium-1 lines. For Hubble, we're showing a continuum, quote unquote, which is really just taking the band in between the major spectral lines, and then silicon-4 in sort of this pale purple color. The right panel here is a zoom in of just ALMA and Hubble together. So ALMA continuum, Hubble continuum, and then Hubble silicon-4 for this kind of main peak. And then the bottom panel here is ASCAP data from the Australian Square Kilometre Array Pathfinder. This was data that Andrew Zick obtained. And we don't see a particular flare in ASCAP, but this date was pretty anomalous in the ASCAP observations because it shows this really kind of high level of polarized flux throughout the entire night that was not seen on any other night from Proxima. And these kind of pale lines here are sort of timing lines, and you can line up the different peaks of different wavelengths. Okay, so that's the structure of the plot, right? What do we actually see? This is the largest flare that's ever been detected with ALMA and Hubble from Proxima Centauri. In the Hubble continuum, it brightens by a factor of 14,000 times, right? So it goes from quiescent to flare, it's 14,000 times brighter. In the ALMA data, it's about 1,000 times brighter. So there's this initial bright flare, right? There's a slight delay to the optical data. There's a pretty significant delay to this optical line data because you can see there's actually this smaller event that follows. And this smaller event is almost not at all seen in the continuum, but is very bright in line emission. And what was really interesting was how closely the ALMA and Hubble data trace each other. They rise and fall pretty much in lockstep. The entire flare lasts about 7 or 8 seconds long. There's not this long extended, exponential tail that we typically see on some longer flares. So this is really, up and down, and incredibly closely tied between the millimeter and the FUV. And so I think this is particularly interesting because it's really starting to show how the ALMA data relates to other wavelengths. If we can vet this, right, if this proves to be true for other flares, that the millimeter and the UV are closely tied, that opens a really interesting window because the UV is the standard for kind of constraining atmospheric stripping, right? It's those FUV wavelengths that are really doing the most damage to exoplanet atmospheres. But of course, the FUV is hard to observe, right? We have to use Hubble from space. ALMA on the ground is much easier. And if we could derive, say, a scaling relation between the millimeter and UV, we could use this longer millimeter wavelengths to actually place constraints on the UV environment of other stars and exoplanet hosts that we're not able to observe with Hubble. And this is, also particularly of note because there's a fair number of, all sky cosmology surveys that are happening now and in the future in the millimeter. And since we've started doing this work, they've all started kind of looking around in their data to notice that actually there's a lot of flares that they're catching in their, cosmology surveys. And so we're kind of getting this millimeter data for free to try and, place some constraints on flares from stars. Okay. Other things that we can say about this flare. So this is showing, again, the flux density, the spectral index, and the linear polarization fraction for our first Proxima Centauri flare, for another flare that we found in archival data of AUMIC, and now for this new flare from Proxima Centauri. And what's very interesting is all of them kind of show very similar behavior. As the flare occurs at peak, we see this deep dip in the spectral index down to negative values. We see this indication of a linear polarization fraction. And so now we're building up a small sample, right? It's 3, but it's starting to get some numbers. So we can start to draw some more general conclusions about what's producing this millimeter emission. This is a plot that Rachel Austin made, right? And so our best guess right now is that this millimeter emission is coming from some kind of optically thin gyrosynchrotron or synchrotron emission, right? Because we're seeing this polarization. So we're sort of seeing, this change in the spectral index and polarization fraction because of this, emission mechanism. If we assume that it's gyrosynchrotron emission, we can actually infer the power law index for non-thermal electrons directly from the millimeter spectral index, alpha, right? And we want to calculate this delta here. And then this plot is now showing delta as a function of magnetic field strength, and then energies are the overlying contours here. The delta, the hashed region, is the delta allowed based upon the calculation of millimeter spectral index at the peak of the flare. The red line is now showing the calculated energy for the flare from TESS, and the blue line is showing the calculated energy for the flare from Hubble. And so, you can kind of mark out this region of the plot here, which is allowed based upon the energies from other wavelengths and now from the millimeter spectral index. And we can actually start to say something about what the magnetic field strength might be in this flare region, right? So we end up somewhere in the sort of 1000 Gauss region. Okay. What's really interesting is that the optical data continues to be pretty decoupled, decorrelated, not well associated with the millimeter and the FUV. So Ward, Howard made these plots. This is showing flare frequency distributions, so cumulative number of flares per day on the y-axis versus energy and amplitude on the x. From all of the flares that have been detected from Proxima in both the test sample in red and then in every scope in blue. The green line is where this flare is, which is pretty tiny. Larger optical flares make up about 75% of the flares detected from Proxima from TESS in every scope. And flares of this amplitude or larger occur, every day. So while this is an extreme flare in the UV and the millimeter, it's the largest we've ever detected, it's a pretty kind of run-of-the-mill, average, everyday flare in the optical. I'm not going to go into this in great detail for the interest of time, but we also have lots of spectral data. So what I'm showing here is the comparison between the flare spectrum in orange and the quiescent spectrum in blue. And so you can see, some of these lines brighten, right? The classic flare lines. There's some lines like these groupings here that we don't actually see at all in quiescent and then are apparent during the flare. Those are, carbon and silicon ions. And this is showing the lines that we've detected with DuPont. So we detected everything from H alpha to H epsilon, the sodium D1 and D2 lines, helium 1, calcium H and K. What's interesting to note is that some of these lines peak earlier and some of them peak later, right? So you can see these two dashed lines here. If we focus on like H beta, right, this really deep line peaks earlier. Some of these other lines like H gamma or H alpha actually peak later. Okay, where is this all heading now? So one of my grad students, Jay Chititi, is using this data, which is amazing for flares, to also try and place kind of the definitive constraints on dust in the system, right? Because there's still this, is there a debris disk in Proxima Centauri? And so the nice thing is that if you observe for 40 hours looking for flares, you also get a really deep 40-hour image of the dust or possible dust around Proxima Centauri. What's shown here is two plots that he made. The background for both of them is a Hubble WIPC3 image taken in 2018. The left is showing the ALMA data from 2017, and the right is showing the new ALMA data that we took in 2019. Proxima has a very high proper motion, which is nice and convenient and helps us sort of detangle what's going on in this pretty crowded field, because Proxima is sitting in the middle of the galactic plane. And so you can actually, between 2017 and 2018, see the shift in the star, and then you can see the shift in the star again to 2019, right? So we can actually trace the proper motion of the star. And that means that anything that is truly associated with the star, like a disk, should move along with the star. These kind of clumps here, right, which I'm sort of highlighting with my mouse, were used to claim this far outer debris disk at like 30 AU by, kind of connecting the clumps and saying this is an over-resolved disk. Okay, what's interesting is that while the star has moved quite a bit, most of those clumps have actually not moved in between the 2017 ALMA data and the 2019 ALMA data, which is enough of a time baseline that they should have moved by quite a bit. And actually a lot of them are in the same place. So that indicates that probably all of these clumps are actually due to background sources. And so Jay is working with the Hubble image and with Gaia and IRAS data to actually try and tease out what they are, because some of these are, nicely overlapping with some known background sources. And so I suspect, and there's still more work to be done here, but that all of those clumps that were originally used to claim the disk are in fact either background submillimeter galaxies or other stars in the field, and that this will, show definitively that that is not a real disk around the star. Okay. My undergrad, Anna, for her honors thesis last year, was digging into another one of the digging into the ALMA data some more, and then another multi-wavelength flare that we detected. So this is a flare that happened on April 29th, which actually has even more coverage. So we have ALMA, Hubble, TESS, LCO, and every scope. Interestingly, we see this flare in ALMA and Hubble, again, very bright, very tightly correlated with each other. We detected an LCO, but see actually nothing in the TESS and the every scope data. And this is sort of the first pass at making a flare frequency distribution in the millimeter by going through all 40 hours of the ALMA data. And so this is the first time we've ever, actually tried to make a flare frequency distribution at millimeter wavelengths. So we detect, quite a few flares in the ALMA data. Okay. This is some work that an undergrad working with me this summer through a Mariah Mitchell program is doing. He's going back through archival ALMA data of AUMIC to look for more flares. I like showing this because he made a really cool movie. So this is actually showing, this light curve on the right. And if I can get this to play, which is not going to play right now, of course. If it was going to work, it actually shows a video of the flare happening to show what visually what it looks like. So he's digging around through archival data from AUMIC, and we're finding more flares. Oop. And then Kiana, my new grad student, is going through archival ALMA data for Epsilon Eridani, stepping away from the M dwarfs and now into K dwarfs. And she has found 3 flares, which are shown here on the left, from Epsilon Eridani. So these are the individual light curves. Each of the x-axis is different, but they're sort of lined up so that the flare is at the center. So the brightest one is roughly 30 millijanskis from Epsilon Eridani. And this is kind of a table from a paper she's working on that summarizes the sample of millimeter flares we found so far. So showing, AUMIC, Proxima, Epsilon Eridani, the flux densities. All of these flares are very short, right? The longest one of them that we've seen is from AUMIC, and it's about 35 seconds, full width half max. They all show some indication of polarization. What's particularly intriguing is that all of the M dwarf flares show these negative spectral indices, but actually for some of the Epsilon Eridani flares, we're seeing positive spectral indices. This is intriguing because when we look at millimeter observations of the sun, actually some of the solar flares show positive spectral indices. So, maybe we're starting to push into enough of a sample that we can try and distinguish between different types of flares or different types of stars. And this is some ALMA data that we're looking at because this star HD 53143 has a beautiful disk, but as it turns out, it's also doing funky things in the star. This is not very high time resolution because this source is quite a bit further away, but we see clear evidence that there's potentially a flare happening in the ALMA data. And interestingly enough, TESS happened to be observing the same source just by coincidence as we were observing it with ALMA. And so we can actually line this up with a TESS light curve as well. Okay, so all of that is really to show that what we've seen from Proxima is exciting, but I think that there's even much more to learn from millimeter flares in general, because the more we dig around in existing data and new data sets, the more flares we find. And so it seems to be at this point that millimeter flaring emission is incredibly common. We see it from every one of these stars, and it's just something that we hadn't looked for and hadn't studied before, but is actually a common phenomena. Okay, so I wanted to kind of quick breeze through, like the extra astrobiology steps that we can do from this, and then leave time for questions, right? And so we're doing a lot of thinking recently about how we use this sort of data, this understanding of stellar flares to try and think about some bigger astrobiology questions and really start to connect different parts of planetary systems. So these are some questions and projects that I've been, just starting to collaborate on with some other colleagues, trying to think about how specifically this sort of flaring emission might feed into atmospheric erosion or compositional changes, and do actual biological experiments to see whether this sort of event, given a realistic atmosphere, would actually damage DNA or RNA-based life. And then another direction to go from the astrobiology is trying to think about how this sort of flares are this kind of recurrent forcing, how it might impact a biosphere. If you have a planet that has a full biosphere, this is kind of the idea of like daisy world, where having these sort of flares happen actually causes the biosphere to react in some way, and whether you might expect to see temporal changes, and that could be some kind of biosignature that we could look for. And then the other direction I'm going, right, is to try and I'm part of a large ICAR collaboration now, led by Natalie Batalla at Santa Cruz, where we're really trying to understand volatiles and how they're inherited all the way from star formation into planet formation into planetary atmospheres, and what processing happens in the atmospheres, so that when we look with JWST and we detect gases in atmospheres of exoplanets, we have a more concrete understanding of where they came from. Okay, so I will put up these conclusions, which are pretty specifically tied to our Proxima Centauri paper, and say that I think this is the tip of the iceberg, and we have a lot of interesting things to learn here. This is a link to the article. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me outside of this. This is my email, Twitter account, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. MacGregor. That was an awesome talk. So if anyone has any questions or comments or anything, feel free to raise your hand or you can post them in chat. And I think I'll get us started. I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about this connection between using millimeter data to predict like the FUV environment of stars. That was like a really large flare that you captured. Do you expect that interconnection to be weaker if it's a smaller flare?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? And that's a big, I will like caveat that say that's a big claim based upon the fact that we have, one flare that we published so far. The working hypothesis that I have, right, is that the ALMA data seems to indicate that this emission that we see in the millimeter is coming from some kind of synchrotron emission. That is also thought to be an origin of the FUV emission. And so it kind of maybe ties together in that when we see this light curve and we see the ALMA and the UV peak really quickly, we're seeing synchrotron emission that's getting spiraled up kind of higher up in the loop. And then this delay to the optical is because we're seeing this sort of hot black body emission from the foot points. And so you're seeing a difference in travel time and a difference in emission mechanisms, which might explain why we kind of see the structure that we do in terms of brightening factors and time structure. But again, one flare. From even that April 29th flare that I showed, it shows a very similar structure. That's also a powerful flare. It's not quite as powerful. So now we're getting to two that show the same connection between the millimeter and the UV. So I think there's definitely a lot more in this data set that will help us kind of tease out that question of whether the millimeter and the UV really trace each other in all of the events that we see, and whether there is some difference in, say, size scale events. And then obviously, to really say something for real, we have to look at something that's not Proxima as well, because Proxima could just be a weird star.
Yeah.
So I think it's really intriguing, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done. And I am interested to dig in it just because the millimeter observations are so much easier to get, that it could be really interesting to kind of prod at that a bit more.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Vlad, do you have a question?
Yeah. Hello, Meredith. Yeah, thanks for interesting talk. And I have a couple of questions. The one, it's interesting that looking at the time profile of the flare on Proxima B in millimeter band, so it starts a little bit earlier than optical, as far as I understand, but pretty close. So it signifies probably the start of the impulsive phase of the flare. Unfortunately, you don't have the soft X-ray, right? So to see the gradual phase after the evaporation starts. So, but yeah, when we look at, and I remember seeing some number of solar flares. So they also start around the phase, impulsive phase, so which coincides with the optical, because first you have the expected emission due to the gyrosynchrotron in the corona, and then particles penetrate down and they hit the chromosphere, and then they form this white light emission that is shown in optical. So basically, you expect this small delay between the millimeter and optical as a result of the particle precipitation from the corona to the optical band, and then forming this emission. So that's interesting to probe the relationship, the coupling between the corona and the chromosphere in M dwarfs with respect to the solar type stars. So my question, the first question is that have you calculated what is the energy, the ratio of energies emitted in millimeter band with respect to the optical?
I have not. So far, I have been shying away from calculating energies explicitly in the millimeter band because we haven't totally figured out what the emission mechanism is, and so we've been sort of being agnostic about it, and mostly reporting, like fluxes and brightening factors and properties of it. If we say assume it is gyro synchrotron or something, then we can certainly calculate energy, and I think it would be interesting to pursue that.
Well, actually, irrespectively of just to calculate, you can, irrespectively of the mechanism, you just calculate how much energy is emitted, in the millimeter. You have the profile and a resolve profile, time resolve profile, right? You can just calculate in terms of ergs per total ergs in millimeter, and you can compare to the optical and see that what fraction it contributes in terms of the thermal emission. So that way you can know if it's small, very small fraction comparable to the solar, where we observe this microwave emission, then you can make sure that it is really a non-thermal emission. So yeah, so the energy matters. And the second question, it's very interesting, and I probably want to discuss with you further, because I have observations of Epsilon Eridani. It's a very interesting object, very young object with the disk, right? So first, I want to know: do you see the signatures of these disks? And maybe I missed. Did you also catch the flare from Epsilon Eridani in millimeter or not?
Yes. So let me just mouse back here. So these are ALMA observations. These are millimeter observations.
Okay, Epsilon Eridani. Okay.
All archival observations, because I also work on planet-forming disks, and so these are observations that I originally took with ALMA to image the disk, and so we do see the disk, and we can image the disk in these observations. It's well resolved from the star, so I don't have the pictures in here, but you can see the star, and then you can see the disk, and then the star is doing its thing, and the disk is still present at the same time.
Okay, interesting. Maybe we can talk about the details of observations of Epsilon Eridani, offline. But I have some observations of Epsilon Eridani in Hubble to get taken together with XMM. So it's a part of my evolving lives, magnetic lives of young suns. So but that's really interesting. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to talk offline.
Great. Does anyone else have any other questions? Let's see here. All right. Well, if not, I'm sorry. In chat, can you say more about the implications of a positive spectral index for some flares?
Yeah. So that is an interesting question. So obviously we need to look into it more, but there's a paper that's kind of a review of millimeter observations from the sun by Crooker et al. In 2013, if I remember the year correctly. And it has, kind of the sum up of millimeter observations of our sun. And what's interesting is that for almost all, the spectral indices for those flares that they see that show in that paper are all over the place, but largely they swing positive. And so, when we initially saw these M-dwarf flares with these negative spectral indices, there was kind of a dichotomy, right? In that we were seeing all these negative spectral indices from the millimeter emission from M-dwarfs, but then, the only other millimeter observations were of our sun, and they all had positive spectral indices. And then, try and connect the two populations. And my, general impression is that there's still a debate about what's causing the spectral indices in the sun, that we see these positive spectral indices. So at this point, I'll just say that I think, it's something that is interesting to look at more, especially as we start moving from just looking at M-dwarfs to moving to looking at these sun-like stars as well. And whether, we're seeing different, one thing we don't know, right, is like I'm telling you I'm calculating a spectral index, but it's only in the millimeter, right? And so it's presumably extending out into the longer radio. And so I'm probing some part of this kind of larger spectral arc, right, where there's going to be a peak someplace, and we don't actually know where that is because we haven't gotten the millimeter with, say, 1 centimeter and 2 centimeters and 3 centimeters and 5 centimeters to sample the whole radio spectrum. And so maybe we're seeing different parts of that slope for different spectral type stars. I think we need to dig into that more.
If I can add,
Yeah.
so one the possible explanation, it's a thermal emission. It's a free emission because this emission at those wavelengths is proportional to the frequency square. So if your index is around 2, so then it's free. So yeah, on the sun at least, we see the signatures of free emission.
Okay.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. MacGregor. All right, well, we are pretty much at the hour, so thank you so much again for talking with us today, and we will hopefully see everyone in person soon.
Yes.
Thanks again.
Thanks for having me. It was great to see many of you virtually again.
Awesome. All right, everyone, we'll see you in 2 weeks. Take care.